Okay everyone, this is part 2. So here we're going to try to give more of a picture of Leibniz's notion of the universe as is presented in the Monadology. Okay, so what Leibniz sort of envisions is the universe is sort of cordoned off into two different parts. That there's a lower part that is about bodies and bodies interaction, and then there is a higher part that is about monads and monads interactions. And importantly, these two are ordered by fundamentally different sorts of laws and explanations. Whereas the top part, so monads, they're governed by metaphysical and teleological kinds of explanations, right? So in answering questions about why a monad is the way it is, you're asking a question about the fundamental nature of reality and why reality is structured the way that it is. And so accordingly, all of the truths about monads and truths about the way that the universe is structured, those are all necessary truths, right? But now here on this lower level, you have bodies and their interactions, and these are governed by efficient causal relationships or mechanical relationships, right? And every body is a grouping of an infinite number of monads. Now, the reason why bodies are sort of at this lower plane than monads is because you can explain everything that there is to know about the interaction between bodies entirely by means of physical and mechanical laws, right? So bodies are aggregates, and physical laws are basically laws about how aggregates function, right? And so this gives you a series of contingent truths about the universe. So Leibniz thinks, for example, that you can look at kind of the world in two different ways. So here I've tried to draw out like a causal sequence of events. So each point is an event. I say event 1, that causes event 2, which causes event 3, causes event 4, causes event 5, and so on. And so when we're giving explanations, and we're giving mechanical explanations, we're giving explanations for how we move from one event to another, right? We're explaining, me hitting the billiard ball with this particular force at this particular angle causes this particular spatial displacement. And that's what doing mechanical explanations get to. However, the principle of sufficient reason states not only that every event, as understood in this way, has a cause in the sense of a previous event, it also means that we can take the entire sequence of events, right, and treat it as a single event in the same way that in a number line we can take an infinite number of numbers and treat it as, a number line going from 0 to 1, right? And so in this case, we can ask questions about, a big event conceived of as this whole causal sequence, right? And call that event 1. And so we can ask a mechanical question about, okay, what caused this initial whole causal sequence? Like what caused me to start playing pool, right? And then you can go back to further events in the past that maybe caused that, right? But again, you can take the whole sequence, the entire sequence of events since the beginning of time, right? And you can say, hey, what was the cause of that, right? Why are there any events in the universe? How is it that we get any of the one particular events that we can describe, right? Why do we have any of those at all? For Leibniz, the authority of this kind of question is secured by the principle of sufficient reason, right? In the principle of sufficient reason, for any phenomena, anything that happens, we can always ask, what is the cause of that? And so we can take a set that is the entire sequence of physical interactions, right? And we can ask, hey, what is the cause of that, right? And then we're doing metaphysics. Then we're asking not just about how particular bodies, right, interact with each other, right? But we're asking questions about why are there these events rather than others, right? And so what Leibniz then says is that, yes, the moderns have done a great job of investigating bodies and talking about bodies and their relationships and so on, right? But that this leaves certain important questions unanswered, like what is what caused all of the physical laws in the universe? What is responsible for the entire sequence of events, of physical events and their relationships? And then, or, even the more fundamental question, what are bodies, right? In Leibniz thinks if you ask these sorts of questions, you will be inevitably compelled to sort of move upward to consider not only bodies and their relationships, but the fundamental stuff of which bodies are composed. And these are monads. These are simple substances, right? Now, monads themselves have to be differentiated from each other, right? And it has to be importantly different from bodies because bodies exert causal force on each other, right? And this is exactly what physics investigates, right? Whereas monads never exhibit causal force on each other. It only can make sense to think about causal force and causal interactions whenever we're talking about aggregates, right? But insofar as we're talking about monads, we're talking about the simple stuff of which the aggregates are composed. And Leibniz importantly says that monads are windowless. In other words, while at the level of bodies, we are forced to conceive of aggregates of monads, things that appear to us in the structured ways in which they appear to interact with each other, that if we consider them as monads and we consider them from a God's eye perspective, then we see that each monad contains a sort of reflection of the entire universe, right? So, considering this monad, we might consider this monad like relatively weak monad, right? Maybe it's like a cell, right? A single cell organism. And in this case, Leibniz believes that this monad doesn't really have clear and distinct ideas. Everything's all sort of jumbled together. They don't have a rational capacity or even sensation because they're not able to even recognize the fact that they are perceiving things, right? Whereas other monads can come to know themselves and other monads with some degree of clarity and distinctness. So consider Penelope as a monad, right? So I have a body, right? And this body is itself composed of monads. Like, my body is composed of cells, right? And these cells are themselves composed of organelles, right? Those organelles are themselves composed of protein material, like whatever, right? And so I have the ability to know with a certain amount of clarity and distinctness the entirety of my body. And then I also have, and so this is like an animal, right? Animals exert some sort of knowledge, some sort of clarity and distinctness of the perceptions that are felt by their body. Like animals recognize that they're hungry, for example, right? It's a homeostatic system that is potentially going to fail, right? And so they have sort of like more powers than a weak or a bare monad has. And so that's why Leibniz will say that animals have a soul, right? And then you might think of, a rational monad. So, you can think about me again. And I can not only feel things or perceive them, but I can also reason about them, right? And so this is why Leibniz will call monads that reach this level of perfection spirits, right? And so for me, it's not only that I sense things with my body, like I have a more developed or complex conceptual, or not conceptual apparatus, but sensation apparatus than any single-celled organism, right? But I also then have the additional capacity to reason, so I can infer things from all the stuff that I sense, right? And this involves for Leibniz a quantitative shift, whereas all of the other bodies, they only knew the world in the sense of the universe, right? Things only just happened to them. They have a sequence of experience, but none of this is necessarily linked to each other, right? Whereas rational things, spirits, have the ability not only to conceive of the universe as, events that happen in a certain sequence, but events that happen in a sequence for a reason, right? And so this is what distinguishes spirits from souls. The fact rational creatures from non-rational creatures or animals, which, Descartes had merely conceived of as complicated machines. For Leibniz, no, everything that's alive has a certain homeostatic unity that goes along with it, right? Like the cell has maybe, in the case of a plant cell, like a cell wall or, a membrane of some sort, right? And organelles function to, in a coordinated fashion where they fulfill discrete purposes and so on, right? And so what happens is that monads can become dominant over other monads in the way that, like, for example, the monad that is Penelope is dominant over the monads that are my skin cells or something like that, right? Like they are determined in large part by me. But after I die, right, and I no longer have control over this body, then I'll no longer be the dominant monad over this sort of sphere of bodies, right? So this is Leibniz's conception of reality, that at a lower level, there's bodies and their interactions, and that these are governed by mechanical laws. They impart force onto one another. But this level of reality is phenomenal. It simply concerns the ways that things appear to us, right? Whereas the top level represents fundamental reality. So to get to fundamental reality, we have to think about what it is that bodies are ultimately composed of. And these are simple substances or monads or perspectives that we can have on the universe, right? And monads come, in smaller or greater degrees of power or force, and so they have an ability to express the universe in more or less complex or sophisticated ways. And these monads can not only come to know the universe as something that contingently happens to happen to it, right, but can try to begin to understand the perspective of God and God's creation, right? They can see that things are not just sort of haphazardly structured the way that they are, but they're structured for certain purposes. So basically, Leibniz wants to say that there is a certain perfection and sufficiency to mechanical explanations as far as whenever we are examining phenomena. But if we want to move beyond phenomena, beyond the way that things merely appear to us, to their fundamental reality, then we have to get rid of the anthropocentric perspective that we have and move up towards the perspective that God has on the universe. And Leibniz is very explicit about the way to do this. It's not to just examine a holy book and repeat what it says, but it's specifically to imagine the boundaries of your own intelligence and your own capabilities, and then imagine them exceeded in all capacity, right? To imagine God as having every perfection that you have in only a limited or a finite way. And so while we're finite, and so we're limited to simply explaining how, one appearance causes another appearance, right? God has the ability to ask, why is it that we have this sequence of events, right? The sequence of events from the Big Bang forward to now, right? Rather than any other possible sequence. Why is there something? Why is there this sequence of events rather than any other one? And to move to this level of explanation, which completes mechanical explanation, then you have to move up to this metaphysical perspective that's afforded ultimately for Leibniz by the Christian religion, which conceives of God not only as like in essence or something like that, like we get in Spinoza, but conceives of God as a person, right? A person that structures the universe in accordance with reasons, and reasons that ultimately we can come to know and understand. Interestingly enough, there has to be a continuity between these two realms, right? Between the nature of fundamental reality, right? And the perspective that we can have on it as human beings and that we can work out in the physical sciences. But where exactly this boundary is located or what it means for, mechanical sorts of explanations to start to become metaphysical explanations, how we move from the human-centric perspective to the God-centric perspective, Leibniz doesn't have any answers for. That they are fundamentally different, but in virtue of bodies just being aggregates of monads, there has to be some essential connection between them. And we know that they are in harmony with each other because the perspectives that monads have reflect the way the bodies interact, right? And so there's a pre-established harmony between these two domains. But we can never understand except by knowing that God would order the universe in a principled way. We can never know how these two orders of explanation ultimately cohere with one another. We can simply know that God would order the universe in such a way that they do. And in fact that we experience, appearances as being structured by physical laws. I hope that was helpful. I'm sure that there's a whole bunch more questions and a lot of stuff in the monadology that I didn't have the ability to express, but I thought that this was some of the most interesting stuff. And this theme of, take some part of a body, right? Divide it and iterate, right? Like just do it over and over and over again. This idea is super, super interesting and forms the bulk of a lot of Leibniz's arguments, is the connection between mathematics and infinitesimally small quantities. And you can really see, I think, in this way how Leibniz's philosophy is related to his calculus. Now, I want to read just a couple of the sections of the monadology because I found them so fascinating and in a way like just beautiful. This is section 66 onward. 66. From this we can see there is a world of creatures, of living beings, of animals, of intellects, of souls in the least part of matter. Each portion of matter can be conceived as a garden full of plants and as a pond full of fish. But each branch of a plant, each limb of an animal, each drop of its humors is still another such garden or pond. And although the earth and the air lying between the garden plants, or the water lying between the fish and the pond, are neither a plant nor fish, they contain yet more of them, though the subtleness of imperceptible to us most often. Thus there is nothing fallow, sterile, or dead in the universe, no chaos and no confusion except in appearance, almost as it looks in a pond at a distance, where we might see the confused and, so to speak, teeming motion of the fish in the pond without discerning the fish themselves. I hope you all found this interesting as I did, and I can't wait to hear your discussion responses. I hope you're all having a great day. Bye.